Welcome to Beyond the Coverage. I'm Chris Horner. In today's edition, of course, I want to cover Jonas Vingegaard because in the last edition of Beyond the Coverage, I covered Tadej Pogačar. So if you missed that, make sure you go back because the two kind of stay in link here since we're talking about the 2023 Tour de France and Jonas Vingegaard's domination and how he became the #1 ranked rider up here on Beyond the Coverage and the Butterfly Effect. Now, a lot of people have described Jonas Vingegaard's Tour de France form winning and talking about Tadej Pogačar, the reason why he lost, because he dominated the early spring classics when, of course, he won Amstel Gold, Flèche Wallonne, and that magnificent Tour of Flanders. Tadej Pogačar is a magnificent rider and has been compared to Eddie Merckx by myself and many commentators out there and people that you guys watch and look after when you're talking about bike racing, whether it's journalists or commentators at the bike races. You've heard it many times, Tadej Pogačar being compared to Eddie Merckx. Now we see Jonas Vingegaard dominate the Tour de France 2 years in a row. And a lot of time you've heard the commentators say, well, Tadej Pogačar, he came into that spring season too hot and did too much. Well, we can debunk that because Jonas Vingegaard, of course, has come into this 2023 season dominating from Galicia. Remember, he went head-to-head with Tadej Pogačar at Paris-Nice where he finished third. Then he went to the Basque Country, demolished the field at the Basque Country, where Tadej Pogačar stopped racing after Liège-Bastogne-Liège. We see Jonas Vingegaard started his racing again at Dauphiné and then, of course, demolished the complete peloton there at Dauphiné to come into the Tour de France as one of the hot 1-2 favorites to win the 23 edition. So when you look at Tadej Pogačar coming in hot spring season and you compare it to Jonas Vingegaard, a lot of times you heard the commentators, I know I did when I was watching, whether if it was GCN and especially on NBC, when they're talking about how Jonas Vingegaard had prepared just for the Tour de France where Tadej Pogačar might need to think about that. Well, when you look at the two riders, they prepared the same way, coming in very hot to the early parts of this 23 season. And then, of course, Tadej Pogačar, even with more rest, with the broken wrist, with Jonas Vingegaard going to Dauphiné, racing magnificently at Dauphiné, where even himself, when asked by the journalists afterwards, up on the podium after the final stage, 8-stage finish, they asked Jonas Vingegaard, do you need to do a lot more work now to get ready for the Tour de France? And Jonas Vingegaard smiled and said, no, I think I'm ready. Maybe there's some tweaks, but that's it. Otherwise, Jonas Vingegaard was 100% on form, is what his words were saying at the end of Dauphiné 2.5 weeks before the Tour de France started. So we know when you compare the two riders, both riders can handle a full workload and then come into the Tour de France, at least for sure for Jonas Vingegaard. The question is, with Tadej Pogačar, when I discussed it 2 days ago on Beyond the Coverage, I said Tadej Pogačar's problem is that he's always having a bad day, if not bad days, at Grand Tours, and I listed 5 of them on Beyond the Coverage, the last edition. Now we look at Jonas Vingegaard, and a lot of people want to say, well, Jonas Vingegaard is a better climber than Tadej Pogačar. No, he's not a better climber than Tadej Pogačar. Tadej Pogačar is easily as good, if not better, even when we're talking the big climbs, because he's more explosive at the finish, so he can steal a lot of time bonuses. I like to be accurate when I'm up here on the Beyond the Coverage with the words that I use, and certainly on the Butterfly Effect, I like to use the words that most describe what a rider would be like. So I don't like to use the words, well, he's a better climber. I don't think Tadej Pogačar is a better climber than Jonas Vingegaard, and I don't think Jonas Vingegaard is a better climber than Tadej Pogačar. I think they're even. But the big difference when we're talking about Grand Tours and why Jonas Vingegaard is the #1 ranked rider on the Butterfly Effect and here on Beyond the Coverage is because he's the most consistent rider over 3 weeks. He's consistent on 1-week races too, but of course Tadej Pogačar is so explosive, he can steal those time bonuses away from Jonas Vingegaard and get that acceleration near the top of the climbs to distance himself, such as like we saw at Puy-de-Dôme this year in 2023 Tour de France, where he could extend that gap and get a little bit of gap where he gains some time on Jonas Vingegaard. Or if we go back to Paris-Nice, where we see the first mountain stage, where Jonas Vingegaard went to the front and started pulling big time on the first mountain stage there of Paris-Nice, and then of course Tadej Pogačar lit him up to go on and take the overall classification. But when I see both those riders, even at Paris-Nice and throughout each of the races they've done in the spring season, coming all the way up here to the 23 Tour, both riders are dominant climbers. There's no doubt about it. And both riders I see are very equal. It takes one rider making the mistake to give it to the other one. Jonas Vingegaard was consistent. That is the main word, consistent. You can say he's a better time trialist, but I don't know how fair that is. we see one stage 16 of this year's 23 Tour de France where Jonas Vingegaard lit everybody up, but we have never seen a time trial like that before from Jonas Vingegaard, and he himself, with his own words, said that that surprised him, which means that that was a magnificent day where everything and all the stars aligned up, and he put a brilliant time into Tadej Pogačar to get 1 minute and 38 seconds. Well, we can go back to the 2020 Tour de France where Tadej Pogačar beat everybody going up Planche de Belfi and put about 1 minute and 20 seconds into Tom Dumoulin, who at that point in time we all thought was a magnificent and one of the best time trial specialists in the world. And he beat Wout van Aert, and oh yes, he beat Primoz Roglic, who's one of the best time trialists in the world too. So even when you look at the TTs, if you take away a little bit of that really sharp brilliance that we saw on stage 16 from Jonas, okay, so he puts maybe 1 minute there into Tadej Pogačar. You look at that TT, the tactical mistake that Tadej Pogačar did in the TT with changing his bike, that takes away 15, maybe even 30 seconds. I personally believe it was 30 seconds, but you cannot argue that it took away at least 15 seconds. So now the TTs are pretty close to the same, where Tadej Pogačar has been very dominant, and of course Jonas Vingegaard. So over the course, it really takes one of the riders having a bad day or making a mistake that we saw, just like on Plan from Tadej Pogačar, when Jonas Vingegaard's team, Jumbo-Visma, is pulling on the front, and you know they're going to go 100% with Sepp Kuss, and then Jonas Vingegaard is going to try to light up Tadej Pogačar on Plan. They had been talking about that stage for half a year, ever since the Tour de France had been announced in October the year before. So you had to know, if you're UAE Team Emirates, that Jonas Vingegaard is going to attack up Plan. So there was no reason for Tadej Pogačar ever to put his UAE teammates on the front to drill it up Plan. Instead, let Jumbo-Visma do it. Let Jonas Vingegaard try to drop Tadej Pogačar. Then Tadej Pogačar can accelerate around Jonas Vingegaard after he's been in the wind a little bit, just like the tactic we had seen at Paris-Nice on the first mountain stage of this year's 2023 edition. So when we look at the words that the commentators and the journalists are using to describe Jonas Vingegaard over Tadej Pogačar, make sure that you make them say the correct words. The correct words is consistency. Jonas Vingegaard can time trial, Tadej Pogačar can time trial, Jonas Vingegaard can climb, Tadej Pogačar can climb, Tadej Pogačar is more explosive, Jonas Vingegaard is more consistent. It's an important word. Now, a lot of times I saw after doing Beyond the Coverage last edition with covering Tadej Pogačar, a lot of people said, well, he's not going to win a Tour de France. I don't believe that's the case. Tadej Pogačar has problems trying to find that consistency going through a Grand Tour, but if he finds that, he will be the bigger threat over Jonas Vingegaard when you look at all the time bonifications he can get. But as I described on the last edition of Beyond the Coverage, Tadej Pogačar is yet to be able to be consistent through 5 Grand Tours that he's done throughout his career, where Jonas Vingegaard this year, last year, and even if you go back to 2021, he was very consistent through 2021, and it was Tadej Pogačar's form that dropped down, not Jonas Vingegaard's form that came up in that 21 edition, I believe anyways, when we're talking about late into the mountain stages of the 2021 Tour de France. So consistency is the best word to use to describe Jonas Vingegaard when you're talking about how he's better than Tadej Pogačar. Because Tadej Pogačar can do 1 week races, he can sprint, he's explosive, he can certainly climb, and we all know he can time trial. This lot of the same characteristics that Jonas Vingegaard has, with the exception of consistency over 3 weeks. So Jonas Vingegaard, because he's beaten Tadej Pogačar 2 years in a row, and beat an on-form Tadej Pogačar 2 years in a row, whether if it's tactics, whether if it's consistency, whether if it's just staying calm and relaxed through the earlier stages, whatever it is, Tadej Pogačar is always being just a little bit off with his consistency and, of course, with his aggressiveness and eagerness to blow up the field when we're talking about the Grand Tours. So Jonas Vingegaard, beating what a lot of people have described, even myself, as the possible next Eddie Merckx rider, Tadej Pogačar. He is the number 1 ranked rider on the Butterfly Effect and Beyond the Coverage. Now, when we're talking about the one-day races, I've seen it a lot in the comments too, where they said Jonas Vingegaard will not be able to win the one-day races like Tadej Pogačar, so he just can't be above him on the Butterfly Effect or ranked in the world. But I don't believe that's true. I had a lot of the same abilities that a rider like Jonas Vingegaard had, where you can time trial decent, not as good as him, and clearly not on the same level, but where you can climb and you can time trial. But I didn't have explosiveness and I didn't have a sprint. but yet I was still able to win the San Francisco Grand Prix. So when we're talking about the 5 monuments of racing and you're comparing Jonas Vingegaard to Tadej Pogačar, of course Tadej Pogačar, with his explosiveness and his ability to put himself in the right position in the peloton and always start at the front when you're going into the last corners or starting the first cobblestones, Tadej Pogačar's explosiveness and that ability to fight for position will always allow the Slovenian to win a lot of monument races. But Jonas Vingegaard, make no doubt about it, when we're talking about Lombardia in October at the end of the season, he can win those races. But the problem he will always have, and a lot of the problems I had when I was racing over the European peloton, when you get to the finish, there was always for me an Alejandro Valverde, who's a rider quite a bit like Tadej Pogačar, very explosive, can time trial well, was well ranked on the UCI list, #1 ranked rider in the world many times, and of course won the Tour of Spain throughout his career. And I was always dealing with an Alejandro Valverde or a Samuel Sanchez rider that has a ton of speed, or even a Joaquim Rodriguez who had a lot of speed. And you get to the finish of these races, and Jonas Vingegaard is going to have the same problem that I had. You get to the finish of these races, you can't beat these guys because they're so explosive. So Jonas Vingegaard is going to have the perfect scenario. And hopefully for Jonas Vingegaard, his legs are going to be on the kind of form that we saw at this year's 2023 Tour de France when he gets into one of these one-day monument races. And then I believe with 100% certainty that Jonas Vingegaard is capable of winning a monument, but he needs a few other things to go his way versus a rider like Tadej Pogačar because of his explosiveness. He can make that selection, and then he can beat whoever's on his wheel in the final sprint, just like we saw many times here at the 23 Tour de France even. But again, when you hear commentators, when you read journalists, the best way to describe Jonas Vingegaard's characteristic is consistency. He's a top-level climber, an extreme top-level individual time trialist, and he has a very, very dominant team with Jumbo-Visma. So he has a lot of the characteristics that you need to win Grand Tours, and he was able, with those characteristics and that consistency, to beat Tadej Pogačar for a second year running. So he's the #1 ranked rider in the world, but do I believe Tadej Pogačar can win a Tour de France? Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. At 24 years of age, next year the Slovenian will be 25. I'm sure he's learned from these mistakes. Possibly he'll learn not to take the rest day so easy and be doing flips in the pools when he's got to be able to beat a Jonas Vingegaard on the next day. He needs to keep that eye of the tiger focused throughout that whole 3 weeks and figure out, hopefully before the next Grand Tour starts for for Tadej Pogačar, hopefully figure out that what was causing all those off days. Because when we look at this year's 23 edition Tour de France, there is numerous amounts of off days for Tadej Pogačar, certainly more than 2, at least 3. And I would tell you tactically, maybe 4, 5, and possibly 6 wrong days at this year's Tour de France that Tadej Pogačar could have gained time and taken advantage of Jonas Vingegaard, but instead lost it tactically. Jonas Vingegaard, congratulations. #1 ranked rider on the butterfly effect and beyond the coverage. It was a spectacular 2023 Tour de France. The Tour de Femme is going on right now. They're on stage 5. They just finished it today. So make sure you watch some of the women's racing because it has been spectacular. Bunch of knuckleheads in there. I'd love to cover the race, but it's a little too complicated for me at this moment time-wise. So maybe I'll have to be in the future. Either way, like and subscribe. I'll see you guys on the next edition of Beyond the Coverage real soon.